Well, good morning. Our passage of Scripture this morning is found in Matthew 5, verses 17 through 26. So please follow along with me as I read. Do not think that I have come to abolish the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisee and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother, I will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. Says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid a penny.
Good morning. Great to have you here this morning, those of you who are here in the sanctuary and those people who are watching the live stream. Now, the live stream has already paid dividends for us. There are a few of you I told this. I had my phone, I always have it down on the first row, first pew there. And last week, at the beginning of the sermon, I talked about Kevin and Rebecca Ballard, who were in the hospital getting ready to have a baby. And about halfway through the service, I got a text that said, thanks for the shout out. Apparently, while she was in labor, they were watching the live stream. And so I'm just telling you, if you're not that dedicated, then they just put you to shame. Anyway, so maybe the most important part of that should be, and I've got this up here, so I guess he could probably text me again if he wanted. Maybe the most important part of that is they did have the baby, Charles Robert Ballard, at 6:41, I think, p.m. on Sunday night. So we look forward to having him here in service, and we will introduce him and all of that. We had a really great week and a great day yesterday. We started out with the free bike day, bike repair day. We didn't give away bikes, but we fixed them. Mostly Dave and Walt and Brian and Tyler and Justin, all kinds of people were there. It really was a great time. I don't know how many bikes we ended up working on, 20 maybe, something like that. People from the neighborhood coming. It was just really, really a great time. And so, Dave, thanks for organizing that, putting that together. Great ministry that we offer there. And then last night we did our missions banquet. So thank you to the missions team for putting that together. Wonderful meal. Great time. Steve Harrigan came from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and talked to us about ministering to refugees, and we really appreciated that last night. It was really a good time. We also got to see Jeff and Carrie Joe are back from Sierra Leone, and I guess even though they really need the rest, I'm not going to have them come up and do the sermon. Actually, in Sierra Leonean style last night, I told her she was preaching today, but she didn't fall for it. But I did want them to come up here for just a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about their work in Sierra Leone, and even if it's just to greet you and say hi, thanks for praying for us, and all of that. So let's hear it for Jeff and Carrie Joe.
Good morning. First of all, thank you, Wade Park. It's great to be back in Minnesota and back at our home church just for a short time. We're actually here to go to Daniel's college graduation in Arizona, so we leave Wednesday morning for that, and we're excited about that. And But thank you for your support, both financial and especially with prayer. God is moving in Sierra Leone. He's doing good things, and Christ is active, but the adversary is also active, and he's a lot less subtle. So thank you for the prayers, and please continue. Tonight at Roslyn Park, or I'm sorry, Living Springs, I'm old. Come and we will be sharing a lot more about what we're doing in Sierra Leone tonight, and there's pie afterwards. So please join us. It'll be a good time, and we may be able to interact a little more with you there.
And that song is not new. It was wonderful. But I want to take you back a year ago to that sometimes place known as Mecca, otherwise known as Houghton College, into the sanctuary there. And all of the Wesleyan missionaries, and there are more missionaries than just us, but the Wesleyan missionaries were all called together last May. And we sang that song, and it was so powerful because that is that is the calling of what we're doing. I believe in God the Father. Everything, every step through that, and to hear all of us together singing that song and worshiping God, I was just like, oh, that song is not new. It's wonderful. It's amazing. Thank you for that. That was incredible. But we are excited to share tonight with you more in depth. Just really quick, we know that all of you won't be able to come, so we thought we'll just say like 3 words very, very quickly. One, Jeff is doing an amazing job in working with all of the teams that are World Hope. And so that is a big thing. Last year, I think there were 17 different groups that came. And there was a need for somebody to organize and be kind of the connector on that side. And so Jeff has taken up that as a volunteer. He is Mr. Kanu, our country director's friend. And so he volunteers and does some of these things. And this is an amazing thing. There's a group arriving today, Day Spring Church from Michigan is arriving, so he's had to do all that connection and have it all set up. And this is one of the big things that he does. He also volunteers with logistics for World Hope, which means all the movement. We now have over 100 different types of vehicles and whatnot that move, motorcycles, 4x4s, Wells vehicles and whatnot. So he helps a lot with the driver support and education and just helping put pieces together. So a lot of really incredible stuff that he is doing all as a volunteer, as Mr. Kanu's friend. And I'm still working with the Ebola survivors. That project is coming down to an end in September. And so there's been a lot of progress and a lot of hard work with that. And then the other project, which you guys are really familiar with and started as a seed in early 2014 before Ebola, was the Helping Babies Breathe, infant resuscitation at the village level. And after a lot of roadblocks, which I think a lot of them were spiritual, the project is finally underway and having incredible results and huge impact. In the first 3 months that Sheila and a couple other missionaries were able to come and be part of in the rollout, we trained over 1,000 birth attendants. And so the impact of that is huge in areas where there has been minimal to no training at all. So we're really excited about that. And then God has opened the doors for a new project, like we need any more work, but and this one is called Child Health and Mortality Prevention. It's in conjunction with CDC, and it's looking at the causes of death in under 5 and in stillborn. And the rate of that, some of you may be aware, Sierra Leone has one of the highest rates of infant mortality and young children dying in the world. And so trying to look at exactly what is it that's causing that, because we have thoughts, we have ideas, but we don't really know. And so through connections in Ebola with CDC, they came actually looking for us, and they wanted to work with World Hope. And so we're going to be starting that off very shortly, and really excited about that opportunity. There's a lot of challenges with that project because it's dealing with death and with preconceived beliefs and a lot of the evil ones' beliefs about death and causes of death. So we're going to be right up front, close with that, and we'll need a lot of prayer support for us and our staff as we work in that project. And that one could be quite a few years in length. So we're excited about that, for the opportunity to participate in that for Sierra Leone. So we want to share more with you, and we're hoping that you will come and share with us tonight. Thank you again so much. We appreciate your prayers and your support tremendously.
And the details about them sharing at Living Springs are in your bulletin there. So if you want to see, I don't know, is the address in there? It's up in Spring Lake Park, I believe. Is it there? I can't find it there. Okay, yeah, so it is in there. So so if you want to hear more about it, then go ahead and take a look at your bulletin and be there and eat pie and hear all about Sierra Leone. Well, we started this series that we're calling Sweet Emotions, where we're talking about what's going on the inside. And we know that people don't like to change. We live in a pattern. In fact, most of the time we live on what I would call autopilot. Most of the things that we do in a given day are things that we don't really think about. We just kind of do them because they're habitual. And so we don't like to change. In fact, that impulse, counselors will tell you that impulse is so strong that even dysfunctional families will tend to want to, at least subconsciously, stay dysfunctional because at least they know what to expect. So if there's one member of the family that tries to sort of rise above, maybe go to college for the first time or do something to become healthy, oftentimes the rest of the family will try to pull them back in by saying, "Oh, you're too good for us now, are you?" It's a common thing. And in fact, sometimes, let's say, for instance, dad is an alcoholic. If he tries to get sober, oftentimes the family will do things subtly to sabotage his sobriety because at least when dad came home drunk, they knew what to expect. But now, all of a sudden, if dad is sober, then all of the dynamics change in the family, and so oftentimes, without even knowing it, dysfunctional families will work to stay dysfunctional. That's how much we like to maintain the status quo in our lives, and we will oftentimes do that even if we know that what we're doing right now isn't working. And that's why change is so hard. Character growth is very, very hard. Sometimes it's painful, which is why most of the time we settle for changing our behavior rather than trying to change what's on the inside. The truth of the matter is that it's easier to have a good reputation than it is to have good character. And so we settle for changing what's on the outside. Now, I know that there are some of you who are thinking, well, okay, we're doing this series, we're talking about what's going on the inside. That sounds really hard. I'm not sure I'm really up for it right now. So I'm just going to endure this series and, in a few weeks then we'll move on to something else. But I want to encourage you that as we're talking about it, that you take the time to dive in and to work on what's going on the inside, because I think there are really a couple of benefits or a couple of reasons why it's so important. The first one is that I think maybe if you have lived a lot of your life in a sort of unhealthy way emotionally, I think you probably don't realize the kind of freedom that you can have when you start to live in an emotionally healthy and spiritually healthy way. Okay, and so I think maybe the reason that it is not more appealing to you is because maybe you've just never been there before and you just don't know what it's like. I went through this process probably 10 years ago, and it was really helpful for me. I just didn't realize what I was missing. And so I would encourage you in that respect. The second way the second reason that I would tell you to dive into this is this, and maybe even more importantly. It's because how you handle your emotions impacts the people around you. Okay? So it's not just about you. Your attitudes and your actions set a pattern for your family. They set a pattern for your children. They set a pattern for the next generation in the church. They set a pattern for the people who you are a part of in society. Now, I know that there are some people who would say, well, then maybe I should just fake it. I should just fake it with my kids. I should always just put on a smile and, try to act the way I know I'm supposed to act, and then I won't pass it on to the next generation. The problem is that every day you are sending subtle, subconscious messages to people with the way you live. Because remember, we don't think about everything that we do, and so sometimes the way we respond, a pause before we respond, a facial expression, body language, we send messages to the people around us and we don't even know it. And so it's impossible for us to always be thinking about how I should be acting in in this moment or should be acting in that moment. And so the only thing that we can do if we want to raise healthy children, if we want to raise up the next generation of a healthy church, if we want to be an influence on the people around us, the only way to do it is for us to become healthy on the inside and for us to work on character, not just what we look like on the outside. It's not just enough for us to act right. We have to actually be right. Monday night, as an example, my son came over to the church. Many of you know that Dave, our youth director, has an apartment here in the church, and sometimes our son will come over because we live right behind the church. He got the keys, opened the church, came over, got Dave's permission, I think. He had your permission, right? Okay. And he came over and he played Rock Band, I think. He likes to come over and play this video game called Rock Band. And so he played it for a while on Monday, came home, went to bed because he had school on Tuesday, or actually he had to go to St. Louis, and that's where, well, he's back from it, but he's sleeping right now because they traveled all night. But he had a robotics tournament to go to. And so I got up on Tuesday morning and got ready. Keith and I, on Tuesday mornings, come into the sanctuary and pray. It starts out my week because I'm off on Mondays. It's the second day for Keith, but we always come in here and pray for our week and pray for you guys. And so we start that at, I don't know, what time do we start? 7 o'clock? 7:30? 7 o'clock, I think, yeah. And so I started to come over, and we have this bowl in our kitchen where we keep all of our keys. And I'm kind of a stickler about that because I hate to look around for keys. And so what I did was I went there and I noticed that the keys weren't in the bowl. And instantly I knew where the keys were. Okay, I knew that when Duncan came back over on Monday night, he forgot them up at Dave's apartment. And so Duncan was just waking up at the time, and so I said through his door into his bedroom, I said, "Hey, Duncan, did you leave the keys over at Dave's last night?" And I knew what the answer was, right? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, "Yeah, I think so." Now, here's the reality of the situation. It wasn't that big of a deal, okay? It was a minor inconvenience. No one was going to get hurt. He didn't do it on purpose. No one's life was in danger. He doesn't really even have a pattern of irresponsibility. He's actually fairly responsible with that kind of thing. The truth is, sometimes we just forget things, right? And that was the case. It was a minor inconvenience for me. And yet, instead of just letting it go, I decided that I had to push the issue. Okay? I just couldn't let it go. And so I said very pointedly through the door, I said, "Well, how am I supposed to get into my office today?" Right? Now, I knew the answer. The answer was, I'm going to pick up my phone and I'm going to text Keith, and he's going to walk an extra 10 steps and unlock the back door so I could get into the church. And then I would walk up one flight of stairs to Dave's apartment, I would get the keys, and everything would be fine. Right? It wasn't that big of a deal. And yet there was something about it that I just couldn't resist the urge to get in a little dig. See, I wasn't interested in the answer to the question. How am I supposed to get in my office? I wasn't interested in the answer. I was just interested in making him feel bad about inconveniencing me. Okay? Now, I could rationalize it, and I could say, well, what I'm doing is I'm trying to teach him responsibility and character. Truth of the matter is, that never crossed my mind. It wasn't his problem. It was my problem. And see, what's going to happen is if I don't get a hold of that sort of thing, now I can congratulate myself and be really happy that I didn't yell at him or ground him for the rest of his life or something like that. But the truth of the matter is if I continue to do that, I will teach him a pattern of behavior, a pattern of responding to minor inconveniences with passive-aggressive whatever comments. Okay? And if he learns that well, then his children will learn that well, and if they learn it well, then their children will learn it well, and it increases this pattern all throughout. It's not something that I thought of in the moment while it was happening, but when I came back over here and I started writing a sermon about anger, I felt like Adam and Eve had just eaten the fruit of the tree and felt naked and ashamed, right? And so this is what I'm talking about. Last week I talked about how we need to, and what I suggested was at the end of each day is going back and thinking through your day and how you responded to times when you were frustrated and how you responded in the moment, and just paying attention to that. What's going on inside of me? What are the motivations that are going on? And so in that moment, I'd be happy to say that that I was able to do that. I wasn't necessarily proud of the outcome and realized that there are some things that I need to work on. This is the kind of thing, and the reason we're talking about this is because it's not just our problem, it's a community problem. It's a family problem. We pass these things along to other people, and that's why Proverbs 29:8 says this. It says, "Mockers stir up a city, but the wise turn away anger." Essentially what it's saying is that our anger does not just affect us, it affects a whole community. They create an environment. It's not an individual problem, it's a community problem. And this is very apparent in our society today. So many people are so angry and feel like the way to deal with our problems and to deal with our issues is through violence or whatever. And when they feel left out, or when they let it out and they start to yell and scream and protest and all that, it just fuels more anger. Okay, you can just see things escalating. And if it doesn't show itself in the comment section, on articles on the internet, or in protest marches, then it's hovering just below the surface, this sort of discontent or this level of dissatisfaction or anger that's always under the surface. And we live in a society that believes that anger is an effective way to bring out change. But if you look in Scripture, what you'll find is that Scripture says that's not the case at all. In fact, the only thing that Scripture says about anger is to warn us of the danger of it. Dallas Willard says that anger in itself is not a sin, but it usually leads to it. And he said that oftentimes when he's talking about anger, someone will bring up Jesus going in and cleansing the temple with a whip. You know, he always says that anger doesn't accomplish anything but riling up more anger. And so when someone brings that up, he says, yeah, but I feel like I can trust Jesus with anger. Okay, we, on the other hand, cannot be trusted with it. And I thought, yeah, that's great. The Bible says a lot of things. Here's a few things that Scripture says about anger. Proverbs 29:11. The fool gives full vent to his anger. You look at the love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13. It says this. It says, love is not easily angered. In other words, it takes a lot to get someone who loves stirred up. The book of James tells us that we should be slow to be angry because human anger does not bring about the righteousness that God desires. Human anger does not bring about the righteousness that God desires. See, anger doesn't solve problems. It only stirs up more anger in people. But anger is an emotion that all of us have to deal with. We're going to experience it from time to time. And so what we need to do is when it starts to well up inside of us, we need to know how to handle it. And so today, I want to take a look at what Jesus says about anger from Matthew chapter 5. Now, we read it earlier, Matthew chapter 5, and turn there with me if you would. It's on page 661 in your red pew Bible there, but we're going to take a look at it and see what Jesus has to say about it. Now, this passage is right at the beginning of what we call the Sermon on the Mount, which is a long, just continuous sermon that Jesus gives right toward the beginning of his ministry. And he begins the Sermon on the Mount by telling people that unless their righteousness goes beyond that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, any good Jew at the time would have been absolutely flabbergasted by this statement. Because if you had a Pharisee for a neighbor, they would be the best neighbors of all. Okay? They would follow the law to a T. I mean, if you're looking for someone to emulate in your life, if you wanted to follow the law, you would just watch them and do what they do because they got it all right. In fact, they dedicated their lives to this. And so when Jesus would say to them, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, most of the Jews that listened to that would have said, who in the world can do that? I mean, they're the best at it. That's a really high standard. But then Jesus goes on in the Sermon on the Mount, and he starts to give some examples of what it means for your righteousness to surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And what we find here is that surpassing the righteousness of the Pharisees and teachers of the law is not about getting all of the meticulous details right, not getting all of those little things down, but it's internalizing it. The goal was not just to look like the right kind of person, but the goal was to be the right kind of person. And then we get to verse 21, where Jesus uses the example of murder and anger. And this is what he says. He says, "You've heard it said to the ancients," or to the people long ago, "do not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." Now, do not murder, you might recognize, is the 6th commandment. It's one of the big 10 there, right? And presumably, Jesus agrees with this commandment that we shouldn't be murdering. All right? Now, we look at it and we say, this is a really important commandment, but the truth of the matter is it's a pretty low standard when you think about it, right? In fact, maybe we'll just take a poll here, okay? See how easy it is to follow this commandment. How many of you have never murdered someone? Okay, raise your hand. All right. Oh, Mark, you're going to get technical with me here, aren't you? Aren't you? Okay. I see what you're doing there. No, the truth of the matter is it's pretty easy to get through your life without murdering someone. I mean, 99% of people in the world do it. It's a pretty low standard. Now, I'm sure that the Pharisees did that. Jesus says you have to surpass that. And so when he goes on, he goes on with it, and he says, "You've heard that it said, 'Do not murder,' but I say, anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment." So he takes what is a low standard, and he actually makes it into a higher standard. And he does it by internalizing it, by making it something that is happening on the inside. It's a very high standard. The question is, why is it so hard to follow? Why is it so hard to not be angry with someone? Well, part of the reason, or maybe the whole reason, is because it feels so natural. Okay? In fact, anger is a natural response. It's an intuitive, instinctive response. We don't even have to think about it. And what happens is our body gets into this heightened state of alert. And your palms get sweaty, and your heart rate goes up, and your blood pressure goes up, and you become tense. And the reason is that your body is preparing for battle. Okay? You don't even have to think about it. Your body just does it automatically. And what it wants to do is it wants to release that energy, and it wants to unleash it on someone else. This is a physiological sort of thing, and that's why it's hard, because it's just really very, very difficult to control. In fact, the Hebrew word for anger, so all the Old Testament words for anger, are very, very physical type of words. One of them means to burn. Okay, you can understand, we talk about burning with anger, right? That's one of the Hebrew words. The other one literally means to flare your nostrils, okay? Flaring nostrils. Picture a bull that's getting ready to charge, okay? Sees something he doesn't like, or red flag or whatever, and starts to, paw or scratch at the ground, nostrils flaring, breathing heavily, and charge going at it. That's the image that the Hebrew word has of anger. And so for some people, that charging means a physical aggression. You want to punch something, or you want to throw something. You want to do damage to something. Okay? For other people, your urge is much more verbal. You want to say something that's hurtful to someone. You want to inflict the truth on them. Okay? And so that's the kind of thing, that's the way we try to let that out. And because it's instinctive, then we assume that anger is inborn and uncontrollable. And then, in fact, there are a lot of people who will say, well, I was just born with a hot temper. Right? And they give that excuse. But the truth is we learn anger. We learn how to respond to things that make us angry. We even learn what kinds of things to be angry about. For instance, how many of you get angry when you're watching a basketball game? Okay? A few of you. Not very many. I do. Right? So it's not something that's natural necessarily, it's something that I learned. Okay? And the great thing about it is if anger is something that you learn, then it's also something that you can unlearn. And that's what we're talking about today. To say that you are just someone with a hot temper is not to say this is a personality trait, it's to say this is a character trait. So the question is, how do we learn to tame this raging bull instinct that we have in the moment when we feel our blood pressure start to go up and our heart rate start to go up? Well, I think there are a few things that you can do in the moment, but you have to understand that this isn't something that's going to happen instantaneously. It's not something that you're going to change just by trying harder and you're going to go home from here today and say, you know what, my temper is solved. Okay? You're not going to do that. But there's an ongoing training and unlearning process that you have to go through in order to be able to handle it well. The first thing that I would say in order to tame the raging bull is, like we said last week, is you have to train yourself to pay attention when you're angry. When you get angry, there's a natural response that your body wants to just respond automatically and let out all of that energy that's getting pent up. But instead, what you need to do is when you start to feel yourself getting angry, first of all, you have to understand, how does my body feel? How do I feel? What does my mind think when I start to get angry? And when it starts to happen, then that's your signal, not just to go with it, it's your signal to stop and to pay attention. Okay? And the first thing you have to do is you have to find a way to calm down. You have to find a way to release all of this tension that is physiologically entering your body. Now, counselors used to say, well, what you should do is you should get a punching bag, or you should punch a pillow or yell into a pillow. But what we find now is that they don't really recommend that kind of thing anymore. Some people would say that, well, you need to vent to a friend. And again, we don't really recommend that anymore, because what happens is venting doesn't really solve your anger. It doesn't release it, it rehearses it. And so then, instead of letting the energy out, what happens is you start to convince yourself of just how righteous you are in feeling the way you do. And not only then do you convince yourself, but you convince the person that you're talking to, and now all of a sudden you have a coalition, right? This is what happens when you vent. And so you have to find a better way to release that energy that's sort of pent up in your body. Okay, a lot of times, some of it just happens when you just decide, I'm just going to breathe deeply. It's amazing how much energy you can release just by breathing, right? Breathing is very important. And in fact, a lot of times when like in yoga, breathing is very important. Why is that? Because you're trying to relieve stress and you're trying to sort of lower all of these physiological things that are happening. So you just breathe. It sounds really simple, doesn't sound very spiritual, but actually it is. Okay, breathe. And it may be the case where you might need to go out and take a walk. It's okay to get yourself out of that situation, but get out, take a walk, let go, let out some of that energy that's happening, but do it in a productive way. All right? So you have to find a way to release all of that energy. You have to resist the urge to respond in harmful ways. Okay? This is just what I call damage control. Right? Because if you just let yourself go when you're angry, then you're going to say something you regret, or you're going to do something you regret, and sometimes the damage is irreparable. You can't take back what you said. And so when you get angry, you have just a few moments to make a decision in that moment, all right? And if you can keep yourself from yelling, if you can keep yourself from taking a swing or saying something hurtful in the first few seconds, then generally you've weathered that storm, all right? And so what I would say about this is that think about this as a soul training exercise. Okay, remember in January and February, what we did was we did soul training, and they are doing little things, kind of like lifting weights. You start with lifting a small amount of weight, and then over time, then you increase it. Now, what this does is it doesn't solve your temper right away, but what it does is it starts to develop ways for you to respond differently. Then the next time it happens, then you don't respond the same way. The natural response then, instead of just going off and yelling or hitting something or whatever, is for you to take a deep breath or to release that tension in some way. And then what you need to do is, once you get through that initial response, your body calms down, then you have to think it through. Okay? You have to think it through. You start asking questions like, why was I so angry? I mean, what was it really that made me angry here? What do I believe about the world? What do I believe about myself? What do I believe about that other person that made me so angry in that moment? Okay? And then you ask yourself the question, is it right for me to be angry about this? Okay? Because sometimes our anger is not justified. Sometimes we're not angry about the right things. Sometimes our anger is just the result of selfishness on our part. And so you have to start asking those questions. Am I justified in the anger? What is my response out of proportion to what happened? In other words, yeah, so there was something that was a minor inconvenience. It might be something that should agitate me, but did I just completely fly off the handle? Okay? And why am I over-responding, overreacting so much? And start to ask yourself those questions and think through them. And you can't really do that in the heat of the moment. Your body just doesn't allow you to do it. But once you calm down, once you take a breath, once you get away, then you can start asking yourself those questions. What is causing this anger? Because the anger is not the issue. The anger is a symptom of the issue. Sometimes there are times when anger is justified. Okay? There are times when, for instance, if you see someone being mistreated or abused, it should make you angry. Okay? This is not a call for you to be passive or to ignore when things are actually really wrong. Okay? But when that happens, then you should respond to it, and you should respond to it assertively. Especially if someone is in harm, someone is in danger, you should do it assertively. And some situations just call for a strong response, and it's okay to do that. But there's a difference between being assertive and being aggressive. Being assertive means that you want to try to bring justice to the situation. You want to make the situation right. Being aggressive means you just want to do harm. Okay? Or I want to fix the situation and it doesn't matter who I harm in the process. So even in that situation, you have to have some sort of control over your emotions. You have to know, yes, I need to deal with this issue and I need to deal with it very assertively, but I need to find a way to do it without causing more harm. Okay, so there's a time when anger is justified, there is an appropriate response, and you have to do something about it. You have to say something. You have to speak the truth. You have to, there are lots of different things. Okay, so I'm not saying that there's never a time for that. There are times when our anger is justified, but there are, and I can't say this for sure, but as I was thinking about it, I think probably for me, most of the time when I get angry, my anger is not justified. Or it's unproportional. Because it's not something that is happening outside, but it's something that's happening on the inside. Okay, that's the response. Now, getting yourself to admit this requires a great amount of humility. And I will tell you that wherever there is misplaced anger, there's always pride there. Wherever there's unfounded anger, there is pride underlying it. An attitude of, I don't deserve to be treated this way. Or, this is ruining my plans. Okay? There's always a pride that's right, there's an undercurrent of it there. Thursday morning, I had a breakfast appointment I was supposed to be there at 7:30, and it was in North Minneapolis. And my GPS told me to go one way. It told me to take the interstate, 35 to 94 and back up on Penn or wherever. And I always think, well, that's just terrible. This is like rush hour, and you don't want to go on the interstate at rush hour. And so I didn't trust my GPS, and so I decided, well, I'm just going to take the back roads. I'm going to take the straight way, but through the different channels. And as I got closer to Lowry and Broadway and all of that, I realized that was a terrible decision. Because the traffic was bad, the lights always seemed to be timed wrong, and everybody else on the road was an idiot for some reason, right? Now, I should have trusted my GPS in the first place, but again, because I'm doing that, when you're writing a sermon on anger, then you start to think about these things, right? And so I started to think about it. What is going on inside of me? Why am I so angry? And why, all of a sudden, can nobody else in this city drive right? Right? And what I realized was that I felt like my reputation was at stake. This is a friend, he was a pretty new friend, never had lunch with him before, and I didn't want to develop the reputation of being late, okay? That's what it was. It was all about my reputation. So I was looking out there, and as I thought about it, I thought, you know what? Actually, these people are driving perfectly normally. They're driving the speed limit, they're using their turn signal, they're all driving perfectly fine. But my perception was skewed because anger had started to boil up in me. And that's one of the things that anger does, is it gives us a distorted view of reality. And when I was able to come to that realization and say, you know what, the problem's not out there, the problem is here, then all of a sudden I was able to calm down a little bit more. And then when I get there, I take responsibility for it. I say, man, Bernie, I'm really sorry. I didn't trust my GPS. I should have been here on time. I'm sorry. I didn't respect your time. And he was fine with it. It was not a big deal. Okay? But again, when these problems are internal, then you start to build them up and you have this wrong perception and all of a sudden things start to go haywire. But I had to look and I had to notice that the problem was not out there, but the problem was in here, and so I had to deal with what was going on in here instead. I had to adjust myself. Now, whether your anger is legitimate or not, if you don't take the time to process your anger, okay, in other words, if you just sort of calm yourself down and then you stuff it, then you're going to create some other problems that are happening. And how I would describe it is that you will transform from a raging bull into a porcupine. All right? And here's how it happens. Look at what Jesus says in verse 22. Jesus says this. He says, I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother or sister, and when he says that, anyone who is angry with his brother or sister, he's not just talking about that initial burst of anger. Okay? He's not talking about the raging bull. The tense there is a present tense, which means it's ongoing. So you might paraphrase it. You might say, anyone who harbors ongoing anger against someone is subject to judgment. So it's not just a temporary thing, it's an ongoing thing. Let's say that you're able to refrain from doing something harmful in the moment. And we Minnesotans are pretty good at this, right? Aren't we? Because it's not socially acceptable for us to just fly off the handle and yell at people, right? And so what do? We let it go, but we don't really let it go. We stuff it, right? And it's still there. But the problem is if anger builds pressure, then what we keep doing is we keep building and putting pressure and pressure and pressure on it. And we don't really deal with it. But what happens is then we develop what I would call resentment or bitterness or contempt. Okay? You can use any of those words that you want. Resentment, bitterness, contempt. They're not the same thing, but they're pretty similar. And how I would describe them is they are all just low-grade anger. Okay? Rather than an explosion, they're like a slow-burning fire, like coals that are just sort of warm and red and all that. Okay? Low-grade, ongoing anger. Sometimes they're specific to a person, but typically what it is it's something that we just carry with us, and it makes us ready at any moment then to not necessarily explode, because again, we're Minnesotans and we don't do that. But like a porcupine, we just sit there and we lie in wait, and when someone rubs us the wrong way, what happens? They get stung. I don't know, is it called getting stung, poked, whatever? That just doesn't sound as severe, does it? Yeah, I got poked. No, anyway. But you understand what I'm saying. Is we might seem like, we're cute and furry and all of that, but rub us the wrong way and all of a sudden you're going to get stung. That's what we turn into. It's this heightened state of readiness. We're not ready. We're not going to destroy everything in our path, but instead we just kind of wait until the wrong thing comes along, and then almost without even thinking about it, just our natural reaction is to say that little comment or to do this or to do that, sometimes to be passive-aggressive, to say, how am I going to get into the office today? And so what Jesus is describing this in verse 22. And he says this, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, which means roughly you empty-headed idiot, okay? That's pretty much the translation of it, shall be guilty before the Sanhedrin. Whoever says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell, okay? And the reason he can say this is because when we hold on to our anger, bitterness and contempt and resentment erodes our character. Not all at once, but slowly. It takes us down this slow road to destroying our character. And the dangerous part about it is that we don't even realize that it's happening. Because we can live in society with this underlying undercurrent of resentment. We can live in society and even have people like us. And probably they'll say things like, well, he's very generous and all that. But in the back of their minds, they're thinking, but once in a while, he'll just let you have it. Right? But we excuse it because they do some other good things too, and generally they're pleasant to be around. But we just know that you just don't say certain things to them because you know you're going to get a barb. Right? It's socially acceptable for us to do that. And then what happens is because we don't reap the consequences of it, because people will sort of dance around us and walk on eggshells, we feel like we're fine, but we're really not. The whole time our character is slowly eroding. But not only does it erode our character, it also erodes our relationships. Because all of a sudden, people can't be real with you. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing because they know that even if you don't explode on them, you're just going to not be friends with them anymore. You're going to unfriend them on Facebook or something like that, okay? Because you're so touchy. And then all of a sudden, our character, or our relationships start to grow more and more distant because of it. So many marriages fail because we have these unmet expectations that we don't say anything about time after time after time, and yet we just pack them down in there. And we build up this low-grade resentment with each other. And then once in a while, we get these barbs and stuff, and we know that we're not supposed to get divorced, so we're going to stay in it, but we're going to be unhappy with it because we never really deal with what's going on the inside. How many relationships with children are bad, that our kids keep a distance from us because they know that if they say the wrong thing to us, then they're going to get stung? How often in churches, because we're not honest with each other, because we can't speak the truth to each other, because we know that we're going to get stung by someone else, and then we start to divide, and pretty soon there's a church split. It happens all the time over things that are just tiny little things that are completely unnecessary, but all because we can't be honest and we don't know how to deal with the anger and resentment and bitterness and things that we're feeling inside. See, this is why Jesus says it's so important. That's why your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes, the Pharisees, and the teachers of the law. Because what's inside is eventually going to come out. Okay, that's why it says in Proverbs 4:23, pay attention to what's going on the inside, because out of those things, everything else flows in your life. So how do we do this? How do we handle this low-grade anger, this contempt, or this resentment that's happening inside? What do we do about it? Now, the hard part about it is that it's difficult to see in ourselves sometimes. But that's why I think the first step is, again, same as the other one, is just pay attention to what's going on inside. Okay? If you have a response or a reaction to someone that is surprising to you, say, man, I wonder why I said that. Why couldn't I help that? Or if you get into a little scrape with someone, okay, that's the time for you to think about it and say, why in the world did this happen? Okay, start to analyze it and pay attention to when it's happening. Okay, be aware of it. Use your emotions as a window to your soul. Okay, and that's the first start. The second one, and I think this is going to be the key, because what you have to do is you have to retrain your natural reactions. When anger rises up, pray. Now, I'm not saying that to be trite or because we're in church, okay? I'm serious about that. When anger rises up, let your natural response to it, your first response to it, to be to pray. And here are prayers that I would say that you should pray, okay? First one, pray that God would calm your spirit. This is not an easy thing to do. I mean, it's one thing for me to say it up here. Well, you should, when you get angry, you should just take a deep breath, and it's not that easy. Okay? But if your first response is to say, all right, and you're going to have to do this consciously for a while, to say, okay, God, calm my spirit. Second thing you should pray is that God would search your heart. In other words, I'm going to look at me first. I'm not going to assume that the problem is out there. I'm going to take the log out of my own eye first before I point out the speck in someone else's eye. Okay? So I pray, God, search my heart. The third thing I would pray is to pray for the other person. Okay? In fact, this comes directly from Jesus in the very same chapter. in verse 44, Matthew 5:44, I believe. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Why? Because it's really hard to hate someone when you're praying for their well-being. So, pay attention to your emotions. When your anger rises up, let your first response be prayer. And I think that it will become more natural for you as time goes on. It's not going to be at first. It's not a natural thing, okay? But as time goes on, it will become more naturally. And then finally, make reconciliation a way of life. Okay? Jesus continues the teaching in verse 23. He says, "Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, then come offer your gift." And what Jesus is saying here is that it's easier to have a good reputation than to have good character. Because so many of us, when we come to church or we, say all of the good, godly things that we're supposed to say, a lot of times what we're doing is we're building for ourselves a reputation. Just like this guy who goes to the altar, has something, knows that he's got a problem with a brother or sister, but he comes to worship anyway and he thinks that's enough. That's a surface level sort of faith. But Jesus says, no, your faith has to go deeper than that. I want you to worship. I want you to come and offer your gift at the altar, but not until you go and you make things right. Because he knows that getting things right on the inside is way more important than getting things right on the outside. Okay? So make reconciliation a way of life. That means that you can't just do it one time. That means that it has to be this continual process. Think about it as a maintenance program. Okay? Now, some of you, if anger is a big problem for you, maybe there's a major overhaul that you have to make in your life. Okay? But even once you get that taken care of, anger is such a natural thing for us that it's something that we have to continually stay on top of. It's something that we have to continually maintain. And the way to do that is to be honest about how we're feeling, to pray, to always be in a state of reconciliation. And it's hard. You have to deal with things. You have to have unpleasant conversations. Okay? But when you do that, you'll find that there's a real freedom in your relationships. Your relationships will not get farther apart, they'll actually get closer. If you can learn to work through that and commit to each other, and commit to not just being what looks like spiritually healthy, but also being emotionally healthy, because those two things go together. There are a lot of people who consider themselves to be Christians, and I guess I would say they probably are, but won't deal with a lot of these emotional things that are happening, and so it makes it almost impossible for them to live with Christian godly character. There's just a block there, and a lot of it has to do with we won't deal with the internal issues. Anger is the first one, and so I hope if this is an issue for you, that you'll really take this seriously, that you'll take it to heart. Maybe if it's a big issue for you, maybe you need to get some counseling. But I'm just guaranteeing you that if it's a big issue for you, then it will affect your ability to live a godly life. Okay? So it's something that you need to take care of. Okay? If it's something you want to talk to me about, I'd love to talk with you about sometime. I'm not a professional counselor, but if you just need to talk about it and figure out some strategies or whatever, it's probably more helpful for you if there's someone that you're holding bitterness against to go to that person rather than coming to me and just dealing with it. But I hope that you'll take it seriously. I hope that you'll deal with what's going on the inside, not just what's on the outside. And I think that what you'll find is that you will experience a great deal more freedom and joy in your relationship with Christ. Let's pray. Lord, we want to thank you for this time. And I know that this sermon is not going to change anyone's life. But what might change people's lives is if we take what you say about anger and what's going on inside of us, and we start to deal with that. Lord, I pray for people this morning who may have a sort of block in their soul, in their spirit, because of anger that they're holding on to. God, I pray that you would allow us, that you would help us, that you would give us the strength, not just to ignore it, not just to stuff it down, but to actually deal with it, and to live in reconciled relationship with each other. And God, as we do that, give us joy, give us life, give us freedom that we never knew that we would have. And God, I pray that if we won't do it for our own sake, that we would do it for the sake of the people around us, for the next generation that's coming up that is going to have to deal with these very same things. And God, we want them to have a healthy relationship with you. And so, God, I pray that you would help us to be the ones that takes a first step to become emotionally, spiritually healthy. We pray this in Jesus' name.